Hello everybody! Welcome back to Needle Workshop. My name is Emily and today I'll be introducing a new segment to our channel called Bite-Size Sewing Tutorials. And let me tell you about it with the very clear writing that I did here because I have the memory of a goldfish. So what are bite-sized tutorials anyways? Essentially, these small sewing tutorials are designed to tackle small sewing project techniques in as much detail as possible and help make longer and more complicated tutorials simpler and more digestible. And for today's segment, I'm going to be talking to you about stitches, all kinds of stitches. So I'll be taking the time to both demonstrate and talk in depth about every single one of these seams/stitches and what their sewing utility is. I'm also going to include a timestamp in the description box just so if you want to skip ahead to a very specific term, you can, and you can easily do so. So without any further ado, let's get started. Let's start with the basic. What is a seam allowance, or SA for short? The seam allowance is the distance between the edge of your sewing pattern and the line indicating where you'll need to sew your pieces together. At Needle Workshop, our default seam allowance is always 1 centimeter wide, unless mentioned otherwise. This isn't the case for all pattern companies though, so I suggest reading through the instruction manual to find out what the seam allowance on your pattern is. All stitches, with the exception of the overlock, must be preceded and finished by a backstitch. The backstitch secures your stitch from unraveling. Simply sew a few tacks, and with the backstitch function of your machine, sew back onto those tacks before sewing the rest of your stitch. The most basic and default stitch is a straight stitch. It is available on all home sewing machines. Generally, the default settings on your machine will work fine for most fabrics, but the length and tension can always be adjusted. I suggest keeping your stitch at a medium length, and if you find that your fabric is puckering, then lower your tension. Once you're done sewing in your stitch, finish it off with another backstitch. The next stitch is also available on most home sewing machines and is called a zigzag stitch. It can have many usages. Generally, it is used when sewing stretch fabrics together. The zigzag allows for the fabric to retain its extensibility. It's great when sewing skin-tight dresses, suits, tights, gloves, etc. Once again, the settings can be modified and adjusted, but generally default settings work fine for general purposes. The zigzag stitch can also be used as a substitute for the overlock. It can secure your seam allowance and prevent it from fraying and disintegrating over time. To secure your seam allowance, simply use the zigzag stitch in the seam allowance and cut off the excess seam allowance once you're done. The overlock stitch is usually made with a specialty machine called an overlock machine or a serger. It is most generally used to secure your seam allowance and prevent it from fraying. But an overlock also comes with an array of functions that can be used in several different contexts. I would invite you to read your instruction manual to find out more about what the options of your machines are. The most popular function outside of securing your seam allowance is using your overlock in the place of a zigzag stitch altogether. Just like the zigzag stitch, an overlock can retain the extensibility of your fabric. Between the overlock and zigzag stitch, I would highly suggest using the overlock if the option is available to you. The top stitch is one of the most common finishing and decorative stitches used. Put simply, it's a straight stitch visible on the garment. Its functions include closing gaps, strengthening seams, and holding seams in place so they can sit flatter. They are usually used along the edges of the garment. The stitch in the ditch is an alternate function of the top stitch. It is a top stitch that is essentially hidden in a seam. Here at Needle Workshop, we often use it when finishing waistbands, bias application, and collars. The stay stitch is a straight stitch used through one layer of fabric. It's most often used around a curve to prevent it from distorting. This is because the curve cuts across the bias, the part of the fabric with the most stretch. Moving on to some more common seams, we'll be looking at the French seam, A French seam is great if you want a clean seam allowance without using an overlock or a zigzag stitch, since the raw edges of your fabric will be fully enclosed for a neat finish. The seam is first sewn with wrong sides together using a straight stitch, then the seam allowances are trimmed and pressed. A second seam is sewn with right sides together, again with a straight stitch, enclosing the raw edges of the original seam. This type of seam is particularly good and often used on lightweight sheer fabrics, when an overlock might look a little too clunky and out of place. Lastly, for today, we'll be looking at the flat fail seam, which is commonly used for jeans. It's made by placing one edge inside a folded edge of fabric, then stitching the fold down. The fold encases the raw edges, which protects them from fraying. The fold is usually finished with a top stitch. It is useful for keeping seam allowances flat and covering raw edges. It is also an extremely strong seam, and this is why it is often used on jeans or pants in general, specifically in the crotch area. And with that, today's bite-sized sewing tutorial is completed. I sincerely hope that this was helpful. If you need any additional information or you have questions, you can leave them in the comments section below. Please remember to like this video and subscribe if you're interested in getting more cosplay and sewing related content. Also, make sure to check out our Etsy store where we have several patterns available for sale, and we'll have many more very soon. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more work in progress and fun content that you will not see here on YouTube. So until next time, good luck with your projects, guys. Bye bye.